Thank you all for being here. My name is Craig Wansing. Kelly Jackson and I direct the Robert Nusbaum Center here. Very, very, very glad that you're here. This is our first time doing Facebook Live. We don't know how this is going to work out. I'm sort of afraid that like your picture will have like the face of a cat or something like that.
Oh, I love cats.
That would be okay. When we were thinking this semester about what we wanted to do, there'd been a lot of talk about legacy and the importance of legacy. So we're focusing on legacy. 2 weeks from today, there's a program on Grace Sherwood, the so-called Witch of Pungo. Coming up, there's going to be a program on the Great Dismal Swamp. So we're really talking about legacy of the area. And before we talked or thought about anyone else, Kelly and I said we really need to have Peggy Haile McPhillips here. And the very, very, very first name. And so when you said yes, we were so very grateful. She's a lifelong resident of Norfolk. For a decade, she was the city historian, which is just such a unique role for any city. And she's written a couple of books. She's president of the Norfolk Historical Society. And we're just so happy that you're here. Would you please join me in welcoming Peggy?
Thank you all for coming. Craig, footnote here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Everybody? Okay. Craig is my pastor, and when your pastor asks you to do something, you kind of just do. So I'm glad to be here, though, and I'm glad to be here. Really. It's a moment of truth. You know, when you're running a program series, the moment of truth comes when you find out if your speaker has actually grasped the context of what you wanted them to speak about. So, Dr. Wansing, here we go. First thing I thought about when Dr. Wansing asked me to talk about Norfolk stories that have shaped us was Shakespeare. Wouldn't you? In As You Like It. Remember As You Like It? Duke Sr. is exiled in the Forest of Arden, and he describes it as saying, anybody remember? There are tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. While the trees here on the Virginia Wesleyan campus and vicinity may or may not have tongues, I take the Duke's meaning to be there are stories all around us. There are stories of individuals who helped to shape the communities we live in today. There are stories of events that threatened, aided, altered, or otherwise challenged us. And our responses to those challenges have shaped the road taken, or the road not taken. My stories are Norfolk-centric because that's what I know, but as you listen, if you all aren't from around here, I ask you to think about your own communities and the stories that they may reveal. Here we go. Sometimes our shape really does define us. If we turn to early maps of Norfolk, we begin to see how our shape, our topography, our elevation, our waterways, has dictated the placement of our streets, our bridges. It's affected the access in and out of town, and even getting around at all during weather events like the one we had last Saturday, or even yesterday evening when we had tidal flooding without any rain, and it was really hard to get to my meeting at 5:30 without going through high water. Our shape has long affected such things as the quality of water, our vulnerability to coastal storms, our architecture. Few Norfolk houses, for example, have real basements, and those that do are often sold as is. Because they flood. Our shape has changed over the years. The earliest representation that we have of Norfolk is a 1680 survey drawn by the county surveyor. It would become the town of Norfolk. It consisted of 50 acres. And the survey came about as the result of an act for cohabitation for the purpose of manufacture and trade that came about as a 1680 act by the Virginia General Assembly under King Charles II. The act was meant to establish a port of 50 acres in each of Virginia's then 20 counties where warehouses and storehouses could be put to make exporting to England easier, specifically tobacco in those days. So few counties surveyed their land that the act was rescinded the following year. But Norfolk was among the few that had their land surveyed, and they declared Norfolk to be a town on August 16, 1682, 343 years ago this week. They laid out streets, they laid out places for houses, places for conveniences like a school and a church, and even places for a few inconveniences like a pillory, stocks, and a ducking stool. You'll notice several things about this map. How small, how watery. Where you see Back Creek, there near the middle, that's City Hall Avenue today. It was filled in over the years, but sometimes it still floods. As a frame of reference, and there are a couple of other, this one also 1682, where they're starting to show land ownership above Norfolk. And then by 1736, when we became a borough, we actually have expanded and we have more streets. But we still have that little 50 acres kind of dangling down there at the bottom. That's 1801. It's still there. Some of the streets, the main street was originally called the street that runneth along the ridge of high land. It was named that and laid out that way because it took advantage of the little bit of high land that was around. And today's main street follows the exact same footprint as it did on the 1680 survey. So when you look at Main Street today and you imagine Main Street in the 17th and 18th century, you imagine visitors like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and others. They would have walked along the same footprint that we can walk along today. And I love that. We also see down at the bottom, heading towards the water, the street that leadeth to the water side. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, when James Rouse was planning Norfolk's Festival Marketplace, and he named it Waterside, he says that his wife was reading a history of Norfolk, and she saw that map, and she saw the street leading to the waterside, and that's where it got its name. So we're glad that it wasn't the street leading to Podunk or something. The street going vertically to the north was our only access by land to the rest of the world. It was first called the street that leadeth into the woods. And then after we became a little more sure of ourselves, they renamed it the street that leadeth out of town. After the borough church, today St. Paul's, was built in 1739, they named it Church Street. And it was the only way in and out of town for many, many years by land. And merchants bought shops there, a commercial district built up for the people coming back and forth from the country. The pale red overlay there against downtown Norfolk, that's the original 50 acres. Notice that the pale red outline doesn't go all the way to the water. That's because all of that land there below the pale red outline is landfill. Colonial landfill, other landfill. We have tall buildings today with way deep pilings because it's unfilled land. This map shows an outline of Norfolk today, and that little red submarine thing, that's the original 50 acres. So that's how much we've grown. Back Creek was filled in by 1905, but downtown streets, including City Hall Avenue continued to flood for many years until the downtown flood wall was put in 1971. They called that the first annual Plume Street Regatta back then. Everybody came out. They were so glad the hurricane was over, and they all came out in rowboats and kayaks and had a good time. Our shape expanded in 1761 when we brought property in what is today West Freemason Street, and we began to build homes there. One of the earliest was Selden's Point, and that was built for a Norfolk doctor whose primary residence was on Main Street. That still stands. That was probably the earliest house built in that area. It was built as a summer home. Streets were gradually laid out in that area, and their names reflect the patriotism and loyalty of the time. This was the 1760s, late 50s, early 60s. Bute Street was named for John Stewart, 3rd Earl of Bute. Duke and York streets were named to honor the infant Duke of York. He was the second son of George III and Queen Charlotte. Queen Charlotte was very popular. She has a street named for her, and today's Brambleton Avenue was originally Queen Street, also in her honor. The Earl of Dunmore was our last and least popular governor, and we even have a street named for him. We were very loyal. Granby Street was named to honor John Manners, the Marquis of Granby. He never came to Virginia, but he was an army man. He commanded the Leicester Blues against Charles Stuart, the Young Pretender, in the Scottish Rebellion against the English in 1745. He was described as a bluff, brave soldier. As you see, he was a very bald man, and at one time there were more than 20 public houses in London alone named for him, and they featured his bald caricature on the pub signs. But good relations with England, as you may have heard, did not last. The deterioration of those relationships ended in a dramatic reshaping of our landscape. It was New Year's Day, 1776, a Sunday. What started out as just another ordinary Sunday afternoon quickly turned into anything but ordinary. Virginia's royal governor, John Murray, Lord Dunmore, who you may remember was our least favorite governor, had been defeated at the Battle of Great Bridge in early December 1775. He returned to his ships at anchor in the Norfolk harbor. In addition to the British sailors on board, there were also local Tories and enslaved people who had fled to the ships for asylum. It was January. They were cold. Some of them were sick. They were desperately hungry, thirsty, and Dunmore asked if he could send a landing party ashore for supplies. He was told no. He tried anyway, and there were sharpshooters on the shore that shot at anything that showed up on the ships. He couldn't send a landing party ashore. So before he left Norfolk, he had one more go at us. About 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, and for the next 11 hours, he bombarded Norfolk. He destroyed many of the wooden wharves and warehouses along the waterfront. Even after he ceased his bombardment, the fires continued. J.J. Eckenrode, writing in 1916, tells us the fires begun by balls and landing parties spread with great rapidity because the provincial soldiers, instead of attempting to extinguish them, seized the opportunity to plunder and destroy on their own behalf. Breaking into rum shops, many of them soon became drunk and went in gangs from house to house, bashing in doors, dragging out spoils, and applying the torch. And we'll add that the houses were empty at the time, so no people. It wasn't until the third day that the Patriot colonel ordered the looting and burning to cease. By that time, more than 2/3 of Norfolk was in ashes, and most of Norfolk's inhabitants had fled. In early February 1776, Continental Congress, under the advice of our own Thomas Jefferson, ordered all of the structures in Norfolk, there were 416 buildings left, to be destroyed. Thomas Jefferson, they said that Norfolk could not really be defended easily, and it could only be defended at the expense of troops and supplies that were much more needed elsewhere. So the rest of Norfolk was burned. The only structures that remained standing after the fires were the brick chimneys and hearths and the walls of the borough church, earning us the nickname Chimneyville. We like to blame the British for Norfolk's destruction, but the statistics tell a different story. A commission appointed in 1777 to review the damage in Norfolk found that there were 1,331 structures that had been destroyed in and near Norfolk. 32 of them burned by Dunmore on November 30th, 1775, to build a fort. 19 by Dunmore on January 1st. 863 by local patriots and Virginia troops between January 1st and 15th of 76, and 416 by order of the Continental Congress. There was now a general exodus of families who had not left before. All were now homeless. They left the borough however they could, on foot, on horseback, by wagon. Wheelbarrows were brought into service, and the troops helped when they could, sometimes driving women and children to safety in their own wagons. News of Norfolk's demise traveled through the country like, well, wildfire, and was a factor in helping to convince the unconvinced that war with England was unavoidable. We even believe that we are mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson was busily penning at the time. In the list of grievances against King George III, we read that he has plundered our coasts, ravaged our seas, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. You're talking about us. Norfolk was ruined, devastated, obliterated, flattened. Or was it? Norfolk people have long been known for their resilience, and that resilience came shining through in 1776. Even as the American Revolution went on, Norfolk people began to creep back. They huddled and huddled in makeshift tents and lean-tos along the waterfront. They set up rough dwellings on property that they still owned, even though it was covered with rubble. Council continued to meet in the ruins of the courthouse to preserve the charter. By 1784, 12 houses had been rebuilt, and makeshift huts along the river sheltered many more of the returning refugees. By 1790, Norfolk's population numbered about 3,000, which was half of its pre-revolutionary population. Nationally, in 1790, there were only 12 communities in America with more than 5,000 people. We had a population of just under 4 million, and we were 95% rural. So Norfolk, with its 3,000 people, was a pretty big deal, and it was still growing. By 1800, our population was nearly 7,000, and Norfolk was the 8th largest municipality in the country. The 1806 Norfolk Directory reports approximately 1,200 houses in town and some 200 in the suburbs. That's 1,400 as opposed to the 1,313 that were destroyed in 1776. And we had an estimated population of about 10,000. By the end of the 18th century, several substantial homes had been built here, including the Moses Myers House, Willoughby Baylor, Purdy Taylor Whittle, those are all on Mason Street, the Tazewell House, which was built downtown but moved in the early 1900s to Edgewater, and it still stands, and the Almond Archer House, which was built on the cusp of the 18th century, around 1800, 1801. But it has a secret in its backyard. This is a wooden hearth, fireplace, part of a chimney, that's a remnant from the New Year's Day bombardment and later burning in 1776. So it's still there. English architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe visited Norfolk in 1776 on his American tour. And he left us with 2 watercolors that illustrate a path to our recovery. One of them shows the devastation of Norfolk and all those chimneys. Then, almost as if he pivoted 90 degrees and snapped a picture, he painted a scene of Town Point. Look at all those ship's masts in the harbor. That's our port at work. It's almost as if Latrobe was telling us, oh, Norfolk, your devastation is complete. How will you regain your former glory? Look to the water, look to your port. That will be the source of your salvation, and that will sustain you. The buried church was rebuilt. Here it is in early 1800s. And today, of course, most of us know about that cannonball that's embedded in the wart with a plaque right under it to remember the New Year's Day bombing in 1776. And our port thrived, at least for a while. Although England had imposed trade restrictions meant to limit our exports and imports, that country was at war with France. Was at war with France for almost 700 years until ending in the early 19th century with the Napoleonic Wars. So England was unable to impose the trade restrictions. We were able to trade freely and regain some of our robustness, but it was a false prosperity and it would not last. An attack on the Norfolk-based USS Chesapeake by the HMS Leopard just off the coast in 1807 was a contributing factor that helped convince our young nation that another war with England was necessary. We gained independence from England, but still to be gained was freedom of the seas, freedom to trade with whom we wanted without restrictions. Our War of 1812 was fought under the banner of free trade and sailors' rights. Free trade being freedom from trade restrictions, and sailors' rights refers to the English custom of impressing sailors from American ships. Some 6,000 seamen were impressed from American vessels onto British ones between 1803 and 1812, the British claiming that the men were deserters from the British Navy. And that's actually why the Leopard attacked the Chesapeake. They claimed that there were 4 deserters on board. Fort Norfolk was reconstructed at this time. It stood on the site of a 1794 earthworks, one of 19 coastal fortifications ordered by President Washington, and today the only one of the 19 still standing. Several of the buildings, including the masonry walls, date to 1808. No shots were fired on or from the fort during the War of 1812, but soldiers stationed there helped to defend Craney Island nearby in June 1813 from an attack by the British. We were successful. We saved Norfolk, Portsmouth, Gosport Navy Yard, and the USS Constellation that happened to be sheltering here at the time from being taken over by the British and possibly burned again. Fort Norfolk still stands. It's on the property of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The War of 1812 ended with the Treaty of Ghent that was signed in Brussels on December 24th, 1814, and is sometimes called the Peace of Christmas Eve. As you may be thinking, the Treaty of Ghent left its own mark on Norfolk. A Norfolk County merchant and landowner, Jasper Moran, changed the name of his property from Pleasant Point to Ghent sometime between 1815 and 1820. Another Norfolk merchant, Richard Drummond, is sometimes wrongly credited with the naming. He purchased the property from Moran in 1830, retaining the name Ghent, and it's still there and in this historic district today. Norfolk became a city in 1845. In 1850, we built a new city hall and courthouse, which today houses the MacArthur Memorial and Museum. 5 years later, 1855, a little steamer called the Ben Franklin entered our port. In addition to its legitimate cargo, it also carried stowaway cargo in the form of a pathogen for yellow fever. Yellow fever was no stranger to our city. We experienced minor outbreaks almost every summer as ships coming here from the West Indies often carried the disease. But the 1855 event was like none other before or since. June 7, 1855, the Ben Franklin entered the port for repairs. It was bound from St. Thomas to New York. There was yellow fever in the islands, as there often was in the summer, and the ship was put at quarantine for 2 weeks, as was the custom. The ship was finally allowed into a Portsmouth shipyard with the stipulation that its hull not be broken open. The captain disobeyed the orders, pumped the bilges, and by early July, the first crew member had died of yellow fever. There were headlines, articles in the Richmond paper every day talking about the fever in Norfolk and Portsmouth. Norfolk papers ceased to exist at that time. The fever spread quickly, first to the closely packed tenements along the waterfront in Norfolk and Portsmouth, and then throughout both cities. Norfolk had approximately 16,000 people at that time, and about 10,000 managed to evacuate, until other ports stopped letting Norfolk refugees come in, at one case in Hampton, even holding them back at bayonet point. By August, business had ceased, church services were suspended, and the sound of the hearse rattling through the streets could be heard day and night. The only commercial vessel to continue to call at the port was a little steamer bringing in medicine, supplies, mail, coffins, and medical personnel from elsewhere in the country who came to offer their service. Members of the Daughters of Charity also came to Norfolk from their headquarters in Maryland on Chesapeake Bay through the Old Bay steamer. As many as 80 people died each day at the height of the fever. They were stacked on the ground at the cemeteries in coffins with no one to bury them, and some were simply wrapped in the bedclothes in which they had died and buried in mass unmarked graves. There were several heroes of the fever. Heroes often emerged during times of tragedy. One of them was Presbyterian. Dr. George Armstrong was the minister at the Presbyterian Church in Norfolk. He worked tirelessly throughout the fever. He visited the sick, he tended to them, prayed with them, brought them water and soup. He lost 4 members of his own family. He lost 7 members of his own family, including his wife and 3 of their 4 children. He contracted the fever himself, but he survived and continued to serve his congregation. Anne Plume Behan was born in Wexford, Ireland in 1802. She was orphaned at a young age, and she and her brother were adopted by their wealthy aunt and uncle in Norfolk, Mr. and Mrs. Walter B. Heron. They came to live in a substantial house at the corner of what is now Church and Wood Street. Anne added Heron to her last name, becoming Anne Plume Behan Heron. She was known for her charity and good works. She was instrumental in founding St. Mary's Orphan Asylum in 1837 and helped to fund it with annual contribution of $1,000 until her death. She opened her Church Street home to its victims of the fever and cared for them with the assistance of 8 members of the Daughters of Charity until she contracted the fever and died on September 27th. Her brother honored her wishes and gave her home and her entire estate to the Order of the Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, so that Norfolk, then without a public hospital, might have one. And the hospital, expanded greatly from the original house, stood on Church Street until a new facility, DePaul Hospital, later Bon Secours, opened on Kingsley Lane in 1944. John Jones. John Jones was an enslaved mulatto working as a hearse driver for the undertakers, the local undertakers. His service during the epidemic earned a whole column in the Richmond paper as it reported about his work. This was on August 28, 1855. Among those who had rendered themselves conspicuous for faithful services, we have to notice John Jones, who in his humble but now highly important capacity of hearse driver, has by the unwearied and faithful performance of his duties won for himself the esteem and regard of the entire community. From the commencement of the disease, Jones has been actively employed night and day in driving the ill-fated victims to the cemetery. The people intend by public subscription to purchase the freedom of Jones, should he be so fortunate as to pass safely through the fever. As we work to rebuild our community, we noticed that the epidemic had a significant impact on the local economy. This is a page from the 1851 Norfolk Directory. It's hard to read, but it tells a poignant story. Someone in pencil, which I think makes it even more poignant, has made notes by the businesses that are listed in that directory, and they say, dissolved, dead, dissolved, dead. Gone to Baltimore to do better. Dissolved, dead, dead. And it goes like that through all of the pages of the 1851 directory, and I think that tells a powerful story. And we're so lucky that we have that directory in the library in downtown Norfolk, which I encourage you all to visit. There's also strong evidence that dozens of enslaved individuals from Norfolk and nearby took advantage of the turmoil to seek their freedom. William Still, in his Underground Railroad records published in 1872, includes interviews with a significant number of Tidewater runaways who sought aid from the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee after reaching that city through the Underground Railroad. The numbers appear to increase when yellow fever was raging locally. The fever abated after the first hard frost in October. Churches and schools reopened with many seats left empty. Businesses reopened, those that had not been bankrupt or their proprietors dead. Newspaper presses ran again. And Norfolk Southern Argus made this observation in late October. In the short space of 90 days, out of an average population of 6,000, every man, woman, and child, almost without exception, has been stricken, and about 2,000 have died. That's a third. But the storm is over, and again our good ship lays her course, her flag sadly at half-mast. We worked to rebuild our community again, and we found ourselves at war again, this time with our fellow Americans. On March 9, 1861, one of the most famous naval battles in history took place right offshore. The USS Monitor and CSS Virginia, nicknamed Yankee Cheese Box and Tin Can on a Shingle, they went at each other in the first ever battle between ironclads. There was no clear winner, but what was clear was that a wooden navy had no future, and history was made that day. The concept of America's steel navy was born that day in Hampton Roads. President Abraham Lincoln landed on the beach at Willoughby during the night of Friday, May 9, 1862, to approve the spot for the Union Army stationed at Fort Monroe to land and begin its march into Norfolk, where the mayor would surrender the city to the Union forces and we would be occupied for the duration of the war. This is the first Union flag going up on the Custom House. And a directive by the Office of the Military Governor saying that assemblage in the streets of Norfolk for political discussions, etc., was forbidden, and parents will be held responsible for the conduct of their children. Our next shape changer came not from the port, but from the initiative of our own city leaders, aided by a workforce of sturdy horses. The absence of any sort of good transportation, public transportation in Norfolk, meant that workers had to live usually within walking distance of their place of employment. This was mostly downtown. It was starting to get a little crowded. That was soon to change. In 1866, the Norfolk Railway Company formed with the intent of establishing streetcar service here. Union occupation fresh in their memories, the City Council questioned why funds from the North were solicited. They said, isn't there enough money in the South to build this thing without resorting to Yankee funds? But they persisted, and in 1870, the railway company purchased 5 horse-drawn cars to run the track. The horses pulled the trains until 1894, when they were replaced by the electric streetcar. Public transportation in the form of the streetcar, I think, may have been the single most significant event to shape the city of Norfolk. Breadwinners were now able to travel by streetcar from home to job. They could move their families into the suburbs, into new construction with green spaces and trees, and commute to work. Land speculators were quick to catch on to the trend and began to buy up acres of farmland, which they laid out into neighborhoods with streets and lots for houses. Brambleton developed partly on the property of Norfolk County farmer John Bramble in 1887. It was one of the earliest. Others followed. As the electric streetcar made the scene, the city map became spaghettied with streetcar lines. They went everywhere. The first, within 10 years, they linked Norfolk with Sewell's Point, Ocean View, South Norfolk, Berkeley, and Portsmouth. Ghent, our first planned neighborhood, was laid out, and people began to move north. New schools and churches were built to accommodate them. Entrepreneur Otto Wells set up rides and amusements at the northern end of the Ocean View line, and Ocean View Amusement Park was born. We ended the 19th century on a high note. Coal had replaced cotton as our primary export, continues today as a major component of our economy. The neighborhood of Ghent had been built, and the Atlantic City annexation and the 1902 annexation of Park Place, which includes Colonial Place and Riverview, was underway. In 1900, the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, APVA, called for a commemoration to honor the 300th anniversary of the first permanent English settlement in America at Jamestown in 1607. The editor of the Norfolk Dispatch began an unrelenting campaign to hold the celebration in Norfolk. Norfolk City Council gave its support to the project, and 100 prominent Hampton Roads residents went to Richmond to urge that Norfolk be chosen. The Jamestown Exposition Company decided to locate the exposition on a mile-long frontage at Sewell's Point. The site was difficult to reach by land, but perfectly accessible by water. Once again, our port and our waterways proved a great asset. We opened our doors to the world, and the world came. The Jamestown Exposition was held on 340 acres at Sewell's Point, now Naval Station, Norfolk. President Theodore Roosevelt made the opening address in April. A miniature city was created with boulevards, lights, and telephone service, and exhibitions from around the world. To accommodate the visitors, several hotels and apartments were built in and near downtown, including the Fairfax and Lorraine, the Holland House and Pelham Place apartments, all of which stand today. The Sterling Place neighborhood was then under development, and the name was changed to Colonial Place to honor the exposition, and the streets there are named after the original colonies and the captains of two of the ships, and even the Mayflower shows up, although it never came here. The streetcar line was extended the length of Hampton Boulevard to transport visitors to the exposition from downtown. With the improved conduit of travel, neighborhoods like Larchmont, Lockhaven, Algonquin Park, and others were built. The area was annexed, and that's the corner of Hampton Boulevard and 48th Street and the original Grace Pharmacy. The building is still there. The pharmacy is gone. That area was annexed to the city of Norfolk in 1923. You can see that huge swath that cuts through the middle of Norfolk. They called it the Great Annexation. The exposition closed in November when the United States entered the First World War in 1917. They took over the land to open a naval station. And I think if public transportation was the most significant factor in the growth of Norfolk, exposition may have been the second. It started a building boom downtown. It created all those neighborhoods and all those taxable people. The years of the Great Depression in Hampton Roads saw unemployment, salary reductions, and organizations unable to meet increasing demands. President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal started a program that put people to work, the WPA. In Norfolk, the U.S. Post Office and Courthouse on Granby Street, now the Hoffman Building, was a WPA project, as were steel and concrete bridges to replace the wooden ones. Several new schools, Norfolk Community Hospital, the municipal airport, which is today Norfolk International, the completion of the Norfolk Museum of Arts and Sciences, today the Parsworth, the Azalea Gardens, now Norfolk Botanical Garden, was a WPA project, and these workers included 200 African American women and about 20 men, and they dug out and planted and built the Azalea Garden. And you notice they're all wearing dresses. Women didn't wear dungarees in those days. As Norfolk approached her 270th birthday, a dramatic reshaping was taking place downtown. It was the place where Norfolk began. The infrastructure was worn out and living conditions were unspeakable. In the 1930s, a survey showed that of 954 dwellings in the downtown area, 954, 900 lacked flush toilets. City Council created the Housing Authority, and a three-phase housing project began to redevelop land around Norfolk General, to demolish bars and taverns along Main Street. 3,000 new units of public housing were built, and Norfolk had a brand new face. I end my story here. You'll be glad to know. But it's hardly the end of the tale. Like Scheherazade in The 1001 Nights, there are many more stories yet to be told and many more yet to be written. So pay attention when you walk around and see what stories you can hear those tongues in trees whispering to you. Thank you for your time.
We have just a couple of minutes. Anyone have a quick question? I'm sorry.
So I noticed on like one of the first maps you showed, there was a labeling that said Lush Creek. Did that become like Lush Street?
It became actually Monticello Avenue. That's a good question. We were trying to find things, in downtown that are here now and find out what they were in the beginning, and most of them on Monticello were underwater. That was Monticello Avenue. But Bush was a big name in early Norfolk. He was our first mayor, and they did a lot. But Bush Street's a little farther. But that's Monticello Avenue, so it still floods.
I know. I'm so sorry. I know there are other questions, and you have a little bit of time. Please.
I have time. You may not.
I know a number of you have to run off to class. Hey, do you live in Larchmont?
We do, yeah.
I just read that Larchmont is Norfolk's only high-class neighborhood.
Yeah.
It's the truth.
I mean, we didn't
It's
even
true.
know that when we moved there. We thought it became high class when we moved. Really not.
We became high-class when you came today. Please join me in thanking you. Not a program next week, but 2 weeks from today at noon. Just a real remarkable book on the Gray Shore with the Witch of Fungo. So hope to see you then. Thanks.